Staring at the shelves of a local liquor store can be an intimidating experience, whether it's picking out the perfect birthday gift for a liquor connoisseur, or expanding an alcohol repertoire previously reliant on whatever cheap liquor shaped your college experience. Some musicians just have a freakish amount of talent. Knowing what brands serve up the smoothest, most enjoyable whiskey, rums and more is an important punch in your achievements of adulthood card. But adding booze to mixers and cocktails is all too easy. Most of us learn at a young age that we are not those people. The realization probably came as soon as you were old enough to read social cues and you tried showing off your amazing talents to anyone except your pet. Daisy is a very good dog, but maybe not a very good judge of musical ability. Those who do have that freakish amount of talent are the singer-songwriters, the people who can play any instrument they pick up, the ones who get lost in the music of their own making whether they're in the studio or on stage. There's something almost magical about listening to a true musical genius, and they've definitely earned our respect. Masking the antiseptic taste of low-quality vodka with juice, or chasing harsh tequila with a squeeze of sour fruit and salt, doesn't necessarily heighten your drinking experience. It's time to put the cocktail shaker down, and up your alcohol-served neat game. Choosing a high-quality alcohol means mixers are no longer needed, so you can put down the fruit punch-flavored drinks and start drinking like a grown-up. These are the alcohols that are so good, you can actually drink them straight. Crown Royal XR Whiskey, the extra-rare whiskey of the Crown Royal family. This alcohol was literally made for royalty. But it's easy to forget that behind all that music is a very ordinary person, and sometimes, that ordinary person is a terrible human being. Johnny Cash's troubles with women. There's a lot of dark stuff in Johnny Cash's life, but let's talk about how horrible he was to women. It surfaced in 1939 as a welcoming agent for the royal visit of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the first ever reigning monarchs to visit Canada, so you know it had to be a big deal to create. Vivian Cash's book I Walked the Line was a heartbreaking tell-all detailing how she continued loving her husband even through the drugs and the affair with his more famous second partner, June Carter Cash. The product is considered such an extravagant whiskey that Houston Astros second baseman Jose Altuve gifted each of his teammates a bottle after they won the 2017 World Series. According to their website, the flavor is rich and complex, and leaves a long, peppery and warm finish. Such a fine whiskey is clearly best when served neat. Adding it to a glass of Coke would be royally screwing over your drinking experience. The exquisite taste comes at a price, however. A bottle will set you back at least $130. Margaret Waterbury of the Whiskey Wash says it's totally worth it though. If you're ready to splurge, go ahead and pick up an XR. It's a satisfying luxury experience and the stuff tastes just like you'd hope. A deeper, more resonant version of the easy drinking Crown Royal you know and love. Becherovka is the best when it comes to bitter liquors from the Czech Republic. It was Vivian who gave him 4 daughters, raised them, and stuck with him through the worst of the arrests and the accidental forest fires, via USA Today, but Johnny gave all the credit to June. Behind closed doors, June Carter didn't actually have it any easier, in spite of the storybook romance performed for the public. Biographer Robert Hilburn, via Esquire, says he was stunned when he found out Cash had cheated on her when she was pregnant with son John Carter. The color is golden, the consistency slightly syrupy. The flavor is harsh, but ends up smooth, leaving drinkers with a Christmassy aftertaste. There were many women, but the most painful was probably June's own sister, Anita. John Carter has also talked about his parents' less-than-perfect marriage, and has said, via Reuters, his mother's drug addictions and descent into paranoia came from a near-constant fear Johnny was cheating again. It's easy to shoot, but sipping it works just as well. Many in the Czech Republic also swear by its medicinal qualities. Apparently, a swig a day keeps the doctor away. The herbal liquor is certainly an acquired taste. That fear spread to their son, who grew up well aware that his family could fall apart at any time. Chuck Berry's Icky past Chuck Berry was a legend who helped shape rock and roll, and when he died in 2017, The New Yorker described him as a proud and difficult man, who was also a genius. He also once punched Keith Richards in the mouth for touching his guitar while they were getting together to organize Berry's 60th birthday party.
That's the attitude that got him into all kinds of trouble, and Berry even had a name for those incidents, his naughties. It started when, as a teenager, he did 3 years in a reform school for stealing cars and armed robbery. At first mention, some may wince at the idea of drinking Becherovka straight. Because of its intensity, it's often considered an exotic alternative to traditional bitters. Fast forward to 1962, when Barry was 36 years old. He was tossed in the clink for violating the Mann Act, a law that prohibits taking a woman across state lines with immoral intentions. Becherovka cocktails are swiftly appearing on trendy bar menus around the world, but hardcore drinkers, especially Czechs, who drink more beer per capita than any other country, don't seem to mind it straight up. Oh, and the girl was 14. He served 20 months of the 3 years he was originally sentenced to, via NPR, getting out on appeal after the judge made racist comments. And the hits just kept on coming, according to the Riverfront Times. In December 1989, Barry was accused of videotaping women in the bathroom of one of his restaurants. The following June, his property was raided, with law enforcement finding weapons, pot, and the videotapes in question, placing him at the center of a class action lawsuit. Barry's camp eventually settled, but that seriously tarnishes any legacy. Elvis underage flings. It's impossible to describe the effect Elvis had on music history, so let's get right to the dirt. He was 21 when he became ridiculously famous with the success of Heartbreak Hotel, and after that, all bets were off when it came to how far he was going to go. While it certainly enhances a cocktail or mixer, there's something impressive in being a person who can handle their betchy. Reika Vodka. You wouldn't sip on rubbing alcohol, so why would you buy vodka that tastes like it? Luckily Reika Vodka exists in this world, a small batch vodka distilled in a country that uses its surrounding nature to create a quality product not entirely out of reach for consumers, price-wise. Along with the fame and fortune came the admiration of countless women, but according to biographer Joel Williamson, via Broadly, there was a particular type of woman Elvis liked. The really, really young ones. The right age to be an Elvis girl was 14, and when the 22-year-old megastar went on those early tours he took along a little group of 14-year-olds. This incredibly smooth vodka from Iceland barely leaves a burn in the back of your throat. The flavor and sensation is similar to a clean, crisp sip of water that packs a punch at the end and of course gets you tipsy. Icelandic water is so pure that drinking its tap water is highly encouraged. Williamson says he was a huge fan of tickling and wrestling, along with everything else short of actual intercourse. And since water sourced from an Arctic spring that runs through a 4,000-year-old lava field is an integral part of the distilling process, it's easy to appreciate the association. If that wasn't enough of a reason to try it straight, the vodka is also filtered through lava rocks, and harnesses the country's naturally occurring geothermal energy to produce each bottle. Future wife Priscilla was 14 when she met 24-year-old Elvis, and just what went on behind closed doors is debated. You don't have to travel to Iceland to get it, but it makes for a good excuse to drink under the northern lights. The best place to stock up on a stash is the duty-free shops at Keflavik International Airport. What's not debated is that after Lisa Marie was born he lost interest in her, instead courting another 14-year-old named Rika Smith. There was a bit of violence in Elvis, too. If you won't be in the area though, don't worry. There's a good chance you can pick it up at your local shop. Four Roses Single Barrel Bourbon served neat is the preferred way to go for most bourbon drinkers, particularly those residing in Kentucky, where 95% of the world's bourbon is produced. Years later, he was engaged to a 21-year-old who claimed he once pulled out a gun and put a bullet in the headboard of the bed she was sleeping in, saying it was an attention getter. The Guardian says in between those major relationships there were a ton of others, many with underage girls who preferably had tiny, tiny feet. Frank Sinatra's destructive temper. Frank Sinatra was iconic on stage, but there was a lot of shady stuff that happened off stage. Let's talk about one part of that, his temper. In an article for Gear Patrol magazine, Chief Operating Officer at Four Roses Distillery John Rhea states, "When I drink bourbon, it's usually over ice, maybe 2 or 3 cubes. When you put bourbon over ice, and the cold interacts with the bourbon, the product will actually bloom." Four Roses Single Barrel Bourbon is consistently victorious when it comes to bourbon accolades.
Even at 100 proof and 50% alcohol by volume, the taste is incredibly smooth and mellow, with a lingering but pleasant finish. According to The Telegraph, it was so bad that one of his wives once described him as a sort of Jekyll and Hyde character, and there's a whole list of physical altercations he was involved in. The high quality comes from the care that goes into every sip. According to an article on VinePair, the distillery uses a single-story rack warehouse for the sake of temperature control and avoidance of product variation. The Four Roses website politely offers cocktail recipes for drinkers getting used to the brand, but notes that their single-barrel bourbon has been carefully handcrafted to be enjoyed on its own. Ron Zacapa 23 rum. Not mixing rum into a cocktail seems out of place for some, but when you find a great rum like Zacapa 23, you understand why it's a sipping rum. First, the ones where someone got seriously hurt. He punched a reporter in 1948, eventually settling the assault and battery charges filed against him. Originating in Guatemala, it's a departure from Cuban and Puerto Rican rums, but that's part of why it stands out. He was staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel when he threw a phone at a random businessman who was also there, and cracked the man's skull. He nearly killed his then-wife Ava Gardner by throwing a champagne bottle at her so hard it cracked the bathroom sink. Sinatra destroyed an insane amount of stuff, too, usually in fits of rage. He took a knife to a Norman Rockwell painting and shredded it, threw a malfunctioning TV out a window at Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, and smashed a car radio when the Doors' "Light My Fire" came on. GQ says some of the stuff that met an untimely end under his boot was pretty priceless, too, like the Ming vase he destroyed at a Hong Kong hotel after someone missed a lighting cue. This particular rum is blended using rums aged 6 to 23 years, crafted using the Solera process, which consists of a series of intricately casked, blended, and recast processes. The result is a slightly sweet, buttery taste that can stand completely on its own. I consider Ron Zacapa 23 as one of the best sipping rums, which really changes how people think about rum, says Spencer Spellman, owner of lifestyle website Whiskey Tango Globetrot. That's what happens when you get too used to having things your way. Jerry Lee Lewis Rage-Hate. Talking about the sins and vices of Jerry Lee Lewis is a little difficult, for one simple reason: he's got pretty much all of them. He changed the face of rock and roll, he helped shape decades of music, and he also has a ton of shadiness in his past. It's rich, flavorful, smooth, and I'd never even consider adding to a cocktail. My recommendation: pour an after-dinner glass neat and pair with a nice piece of dark chocolate. Kings County Distillery Chocolate Whiskey. Speaking of chocolate, chocolate plus whiskey sounds awesome, but few have managed to marry the two as well as Kings County Distillery has. Their product, which is produced completely in Brooklyn, combines their signature moonshine with ground cacao bean husks from Mast Brothers chocolate. The result is a bittersweet taste with a warm finish that is surprisingly smooth and delightful. According to Wendell Britt from the Whiskey Wash, this flavoring doesn't just make the whiskey more approachable, it also provides a more complex flavor. So while it's tempting to throw together a chocolate-based cocktail, you'd be doing the whiskey a disservice if that's your first introduction to the brand. It's a great drink to sip on when you're looking to relax after dinner. It's all of the reward that comes with a bar of chocolate, with a flavor that lingers longer than if you'd eaten an actual bar. Del Maguey Chichicapa Mezcal. Taste a bit of smoke in your cocktail? It's likely to be mezcal, a Mexican alcohol that differs from tequila in the way it's distilled, where it's produced, and which kind of agave it uses. A lot can be traced back to a nasty temper and a violent streak, but finding it all is tricky. The Guardian interviewed him in 2015, and said it's almost impossible to figure out what's truth and what's legend, including the circumstances around his nickname, the Killer. The story Lewis tells is that a friend just. New York Times writer Eric Asimov named Del Maguey Chichicapa his #1 pick after sampling several brands back in 2010, when mezcal was on the rise. While it's quickly gaining popularity in the United States and can be found in bars high and low, drinking it straight is an adventure on its own. According to the Del Maguey website, Chichicapa, which is named for the village where it's made, contains nose of sweet roasted agave and toasted corn, palate of dried fruit and sweet almond, and finish of chocolate and mint. This mezcal is one instance where drinkers aren't blowing smoke when it comes to being satisfied. Emma Janssen from Serious Eats recommends Chichicapa for those intent on savoring slowly and leisurely. Plymouth Gin. If it's good enough for the Navy, it's good enough for your glass. A classic staple in the gin community, Plymouth Gin has been around since 1793, when it was originally produced by Dominican monks. The taste is fragrant and slightly bitter, the finish, elegant, long, fresh and aromatic. Sippers definitely experience a florally combination of 7 different kinds of botanicals, including juniper berries, which give it its signature gin taste, lemon peels and coriander seed. According to their website, for almost 200 years, Her Majesty's naval fleet and Plymouth Navy strength were inseparable, with no ship leaving port without a bottle on board. That's a big commitment, but it's a clear choice based on quality. At least you don't have to be part of a fleet to enjoy it. The age-old standards of this gin makes it one of the easiest to drink straight. Try it neat to understand its complexities before grabbing that bottle of tonic. Key Platinum Extra Añejo Clear Tequila Chante Cosme of Complex Magazine writes, "A fine tequila does not require you to lap up a rim's worth of Morton salt for it to be palpable, nor does it need to be saturated with a sea of sugar-laden sour mix. And when it comes to the world's first Platinum Extra Añejo tequila, drinking it neat is definitely the norm." Called him that one day for no discernible reason, but it's also possible it came after he tried to strangle and kill one of his teachers, an act he fully admits to. Lewis has had 7 wives, and 2 died mysteriously, one by drowning and one by overdose. The latter incident went to court, where Lewis was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing. Key has created an exemplary product. It's so special that the typical amber color is removed after being filtered 9 times after the aging process, then distilled a 3rd time, according to Jason Fine in an article for Men's Journal. It's part of why, when you're drinking it, there's no overbearing alcohol smell or harsh burn, aka raspa. It's a tequila that's meant to be enjoyed over a long period of time, like when you're watching the sun go down in Mexico, not rushing to suck on a lime after some sloppy shots at a bachelorette party. But the law was not on his side after he shot his bass player in the chest and had to pay out $125,000. Lewis' 7th marriage was to the ex-sister-in-law of his 3rd wife, the most infamous. Myra was 13 years old, and the daughter of Lewis' cousin. After savoring a sip or two, you'll understand why it puts the key in tequila. Green Spot Irish whiskey. In a world where most people consider Guinness to be their Irish drink of choice, Jameson has done an incredible job of making drinkers rethink what Irish whiskey really means. Oh, and Medium says, he was still technically married to his 2nd wife at the time. It's no wonder Lewis lies awake at night and worries whether he's going to heaven or hell. James Levine's predatory behavior. You can't get much bigger than the Metropolitan Opera, and for more than 40 years, conductor James Levine was at the head of it. He sported titles like Director Emeritus and worked with the company's Young Artists program as Artistic Director. What sets Green Spot apart, however, is that it's part of the single pot still, something that only happens in Ireland. According to Richard Thomas of Paste magazine, what makes single pot still so unique is that it comes from a single distillery, is made in a pot still and with barley. Whereas single malts are made from 100% malted barley, single pot still whiskey is made with both malted and unmalted, green, barley. Its brother, Yellow Spot, is a higher-end whiskey that delivers an incredible drinking experience, but Green Spot is definitely an affordable alternative packing a nice punch. The last one is particularly creepy, given that the New York Times announced in March 2018 the Met was officially, and loudly, ending its association with him amid accusations of sexually abusive and harassing conduct. Not a lot of details were released, but sometimes, just a few details are enough. It results in a creamy mouthfeel, after delighting drinkers with hints of cinnamon, vanilla, and brown sugar sensations. In this way, it's best left as is and as far from the ginger ale bottle as possible. Dewazakura Oka Ginjo sake will either make or break a drinker. But one thing is for sure. This is an alcohol that should rarely, if ever, be mixed. Sure, sake cocktails exist, but why dilute a flavor that's been around for over 2,000 years? With all the variations sake has to offer, it's easy enough to find one that fits your tastes. A clear winner, however, is Dewazakura Oka Ginjo, a sake brewed in a city called Tendo, of the Yamagata prefecture.
It's relatively new to foreign markets, its rarity partially responsible for the Ginjo boom, with the popularity of Oka Ginjo leading the way. According to their website, Oka Ginjo is a lighter sake, best served cold, neither too sweet nor too dry. It's best when paired with fish, especially sushi, as it adds a simple floral taste and is light enough so as not to detract from your meal. Aperol. If you're unfamiliar with this Italian liqueur, you're probably not alone. It's not exactly a household staple, but you'll spy it on the shelf at most bars and liquor stores around the other aperitifs. Liqueurs designed to wake up the digestive system and stimulate your appetite before a meal. The Met's investigation involved interviews with 70 people, and it ended with an official statement saying there was credible evidence that Mr. Levine engaged in sexually abusive conduct toward vulnerable artists in the early stages of their careers. Levine didn't comment on the firing, which came after a December 2017 suspension prompted by 4 men who came forward to say they had been targeted by the conductor when they were still teenagers. Recently, bars serving up craft cocktails have turned to Aperol as a mixer, using it in cocktails like the paper plane made with equal parts bourbon, Aperol, Amaro Nonino, and fresh lemon juice. Levine denied the accusations then, but things started looking very, very bad with the revelation it wasn't the first time he'd been accused of that sort of thing. It's also popular as part of the refreshing Aperol Spritz, Aperol and Prosecco, but we wondered if it would stand up as a solo sipper. It turns out it's a fantastic option. There were rumors of abuse as far back as the 1960s, when Levine was working at the Meadowbrook School of Music. On their website, Aperol describes the flavor as zesty orange with complex herbal scents harmonized with a touch of vanilla, and it finishes with a pleasant herbaceous bitterness. With accusations firmly out in the public eye now, one of his accusers was quoted as saying, "The truth can be very useful. It doesn't hurt that this liqueur boasts a surprisingly low alcohol content, clocking in at only 11%. The truth creates good." CeeLo Green's views on consent. CeeLo Green hit something of a rough patch in 2012 and 2013, and it gets a little complicated. That means the bittersweet flavor of the orange and herbs can come through without being stifled by a harsh alcohol finish. According to The Guardian, his troubles only started when he was accused of both giving a woman ecstasy and later raping her. Sounds perfect for waking up your palate before a big meal or sipping on the porch during a hot summer day. Five Farms Irish Cream. Irish cream doesn't exactly have a reputation that would inspire you to drink it on the rocks. It's most commonly used to celebrate St. Green ultimately pleaded no contest to the drug felony and got 3 years of probation, along with 45 days of community service. The rape charges simply went away because Green's lawyer argued there was no proof it wasn't consensual. That's skeevy, and it gets worse. Patrick's Day, booze up your coffee, or turn a White Russian into a mudslide and a martini into a chocolatini. While most people think of Baileys when it comes to Irish cream, there's a better option, especially if you're drinking it on the rocks. Five Farms Irish Cream is made in County Cork, Ireland, and the company describes it as a true farm-to-table product. Each bottle is made from a single batch of fresh cream sourced from 5 local, family-run farms. The cream is then mixed with real Irish whiskey, creating a concoction that earned the highest-scoring Irish cream liqueur in history, 97 points at the 2018 Ultimate Spirits Challenge. The judges described it as having flavors of coffee with fresh cream, dulce de leche, coconut, maple, and Belgian waffles. Drink it after dinner instead of dessert, and you might just find yourself an Irish cream on the rocks convert. Disaronno Original. Remember that oddly sensual Disaronno commercial where a woman ordered Disaronno on the rocks and her entire group ended up sucking on the ice cubes, presumably, because it tasted so great? Well, the commercial might have been annoying, but the concept behind it is solid. Green took to Twitter to voice his opinions on rape, and saying they're horrible opinions is a huge understatement. This almond-flavored amaretto liqueur is rich and sweet, and it goes down easy. He wrote, "People who have really been raped remember. And, if someone is passed out, they're not even with you consciously. So with implies consent." The Twitterverse's meltdown was immediate, and even though he deleted the tweets, other Twitterers saved them to prove that once something's on the internet, it's definitely not going away. That's true for everything, and it's especially true when it's a sentiment like that.
Most bartenders use it to make drinks like the amaretto sour, combine it with scotch for the Godfather drink, or serve it over ice cream. Our favorite way to enjoy it? On the rocks as a sipper after dinner treat, either with dessert or as a dessert replacement. What makes Disaronno's amaretto so much tastier than other brands? Well, it's hard to say exactly. They've closely guarded the secret family recipe since the 1500s, but we do know that it doesn't actually contain almonds. Green apologized, saying he'd never condone the harm of any women, but he still became another poster child for proof of just how healthy modern rape culture is, via Mike. Miles Davis, drugs, abuse. If there was ever a human being who embodied the spirit of music, that human was Miles Davis and the spirit was jazz. But he was also such a horrible human that when the New York Times reported there was going to be a movie made about his life, they also said it presented some problems. First, let's mention the fact he used to play with his back to his fans, and God help anyone who was brazen enough to walk up to him. The American Academy of Allergy, Asthma and Immunology confirms that Disaronno Original is nut-free, made with apricot kernel oil and 17 herbs and fruits. There was the insane vanity, to the point where, via The Atlantic, he condemned music critics for writing pieces that sang the praises of anyone else, claiming they were just out to take away his spotlight. Then there were the heroin and cocaine addictions, stories of pimping, and his abusive relationships with the women he married. Ex-wife Frances Davis has claimed she wasn't just terrified of him, she ran away a few times convinced he was going to kill her. Something about that complex combination creates a smooth, unforgettable experience, so sip away without the need for a mixer. Balveni Caribbean Cask Scotch isn't for everyone, but aficionados know it's best to drink it without any mixers. He admitted to the whole sordid trend of beating his wives in his autobiography, Miles, and even admitted he approved of other men hitting their wives and girlfriends to keep them in line. Richard Wagner's maniacal anti-Semitism. Wagner died in 1883, decades before the rise of Hitler and his Nazis. That means he wasn't around to see his music heralded as the soundtrack of the rise of modern anti-Semitism, but he probably wouldn't have hated the association. According to D.W., Wagner got more and more vocal about his anti-Semitic views as he got older. He wrote a ton of jaw-dropping stuff, believing Jews couldn't produce art, only mimic what they'd seen and heard from others. When he struggled as an up-and-coming composer, he blamed Jewish critics for keeping him from success. Aging the strong liquor in casks or barrels for a minimum of 3 years, or as long as 50 years, deepens its flavor and mellows out any harsh alcohol tones, making it smooth and sippable. Later, he did form associations with Jewish philosophers and patrons, but that led into his other bit of shadiness. Wagner and wife Cosima, who continued his anti-Semitic crusade after his death, so relentlessly demanded money from the King of Bavaria that the Telegraph says banks started paying them with thousands of coins in hopes of sending a message. Some Scotch, especially those from Islay, contain heavy smoked flavors because of their use of peat, but Balvenie is in a different class of Scotch. It didn't work. Cosima herself was originally a wife of one of the men in Wagner's entourage, and they only married after a long-term affair resulting in a daughter. It's still debatable just how devoted to her he was. It's not smoky at all, and their aging process makes it an excellent intro sipper for rum lovers. Balvenie normally ages their single malt whiskey in oak casks for 14 years to give it a smooth finish and a honeyed flavor. For their Caribbean cask, they take an extra step, finishing the aged Scotch in rum barrels. He was carrying on with at least one other mistress while he was courting her, so there's that. Brian Jones. Anti-establishment and abusive Brian Jones, at Right, died when he was 27, and when Rolling Stone reported on the mysterious circumstances of his death, they did it in an article subtitled Sympathy for the Devil. That infuses it with notes of toffee and a hint of fruit, with a warm, lingering finish, creating an easy drinking, super sippable Scotch. After a few sips, you may wonder why you've always preferred whiskey and bourbon to Scotch. Cutwater Fugu Horchata Vodka Horchata is definitely one of those Mexican foods you have to try before you die. The beverage is wildly popular in Latin America. That's not just a clever play on one of the Stones songs. Jones made Keith Richards look like the one you'd choose to bring home to meet your parents. There were, of course, the drugs and the pills that ultimately led to him parting ways with the rest of the band not long before his drowning death. His troubles started long before that, though, and he was kicked out of his grammar school for inciting rebellion. It's traditionally made by soaking and pureeing nuts and seeds, usually rice and almonds, although some recipes use barley or sesame seeds. He held down a ton of random jobs, got in the face of the popular press who didn't understand, or particularly like, what they were doing, and behind closed doors he had a violent streak a mile long. Anita Pallenberg was one of the original muses for the Stones, and she'd eventually go on to have a long-term relationship with Richards. Each recipe is different, but the creamy liquid is usually infused with sugar, cinnamon, vanilla, and other spices, creating a sweet, soothing drink that can tame the heat of the hottest chili pepper. Cutwater Spirits took things to the next level when they infused the flavor of horchata into vodka, creating a higher proof version of our favorite drink. But she started out with Jones, says Rolling Stone, and it was an abusive relationship that ended when Jones hit her so hard he broke his hand on her face. Sympathy for the devil, indeed. Pretty much everything about Morrissey. If you want to talk about a guy who's been very vocal about some unpopular opinions, Morrissey is your guy. In 2007, The Independent picked up an interview he did lamenting what he saw as the death of Britishness. While he denied being either xenophobic or racist, he was still quoted as saying things like, "Although I don't have anything against people from other countries. It could certainly be used instead of regular vodka to make a spicier White Russian, and they even recommend mixing it with coffee stout to create a nuanced beer cocktail. But, after we tried this bold vodka, we couldn't help but ask for it on the rocks. The price of immigration is enormous. Travel to England and you have no idea where you are." The Manchester-born Morrissey is the son of Irish immigrants, and he later immigrated to Los Angeles and then on to Rome, so it has enough flavor to stand on its own, so why not just drink it straight? Yeah. 3 years later, The Guardian ran an interview with the vegetarian, who went on record condemning the animals' rights abuses going on in China. He then continued, "You can't help but feel that the Chinese are a subspecies." When the Harvey Weinstein scandal broke, Morrissey, via The Independent, had this to say, "I hate sexual situations that are forced on someone. But in many cases, one looks at the circumstances and thinks that the person who is considered a victim is merely disappointed. He's targeted so many people." Rolling Stone did a roundup of his most controversial opinions, and it included blaming Kate Middleton for the suicide of a nurse, shrugging off a massacre that left 77 people dead as nothing compared to what happens in McDonald's every day, and called for Elton John's head to be served to him on a plate. James Brown and domestic abuse. James Brown's daughter, Yama, released her memoir Cold Sweat: My Father James Brown and Me in 2016. It was a heartbreaking, cautionary tale of a girl who grew up in a family where domestic abuse was the norm, a girl who ended up in an abusive marriage of her own. She says even though he never turned on her, she grew up terrified he would. She described some insane incidents, including one, via The Independent, where she wrote, "Blood spurted from my mother's face. She started thrashing around, kicking her legs, holding up her arms to ward off the punches and trying to break free, trying to save herself." There were other incidents, too. In 2004, Rolling Stone reported Brown was arrested for shoving then-wife Tommy Ray Brown and sending her to the hospital. That mean streak didn't keep him from having an indeterminate amount of illegitimate, and often unacknowledged, children. As The Telegraph reported after his death, forgotten sons and daughters started coming forward with DNA proof they were Brown's kids. Brown was also at the heart of a change in legislature. Jacques Holland came forward in 2005 and accused Brown of a 1998 rape, but the case was refused because of the time that elapsed. NME reported the laws were changed to give victims more time to report a crime, a result Hollander was happy with. Peter McNeil's child molestation charges cake is one of those groups you probably forgot you used to listen to all the time. But before you go back and dig out your CDs, let's talk about what drummer Peter McNeil has been up to. McNeil, who was also the drummer for Norah Jones, made Rolling Stone headlines in 2014 for one of the most despicable reasons you can imagine. The verdict of his court case was in, and he was sentenced to 15 years to life in jail and was a permanent addition to the sex offender registry. Noisy said it wasn't just because of a single incident, either. The details are way too terrible to repeat, so let's just say one incident happened while he was volunteering at a school in Los Angeles. Another one of his victims was only 3 years old at the time, and that's as terrible as it gets. Johnny Paycheck's attempted murders. Johnny Paycheck, originally named Donald Eugene Lytle, was one of the Grand Ole Opry's most respected members, and an icon who helped build country music. He was known as something of a country music outlaw, too, says CMT, and his entire career was colored by drug and alcohol use. His difficulty staying out of trouble started way before he was a star, though, and when he was still a teenager he enlisted in the U.S. Navy, punched a superior officer, and spent a few years in prison. The record deal came after that, and so did the check forgery and the attempted murder. That happened on December 19, 1985, says Rolling Stone. Paycheck was on his way home for the holidays when he stopped off at a Hillsboro, Ohio, bar for a drink. He was recognized by a local named Larry Wise, they got to chatting, and no one's entirely sure what happened next. Whatever offenses were caused, it ended with Paycheck pulling out a gun and shooting. The bullet grazed Wise's head, and he'd later testify the music legend had blowed my hat off. The case dragged on. Paycheck was eventually sentenced to 9 years and even tried to revive his career post-prison before he died in 2003. Steven Tyler's child girlfriend. There are two sides to every story, and really, both sides to this one are uncomfortable. When Aerosmith frontman Steven Tyler wrote his 2011 memoir Does the Noise in My Head Bother You?, he talked a bit about early girlfriend Julia Holcomb, and managed to misspell her name in the book's acknowledgments, notes the Boston Globe. Tyler wrote he had nicknamed her Little Bo Peep, said they liked to get it on in public, and left out a lot of the other details. Holcomb wanted to clear the air about what she says really happened, so she took to LifeSite to tell her side of the story. According to her, she was a 16-year-old from a broken family when she met Tyler and kicked off a relationship with him that really started when her troubled mother signed documents making Tyler her legal guardian. Holcomb says she was already pregnant by the time he asked her to marry him, and plans for a family started to fall apart when his grandmother refused to pass on her ring. 5 months into the pregnancy, Holcomb was trapped in a house fire and sent to the hospital, where she says Tyler convinced her to have an abortion. Jezebel notes that he also talks about it in Walk This Way, Aerosmith's autobiography. Holcomb left him, he had already moved on to other women, and returned to her parents. Tyler returned to the rock star life. Michael Brewer. Total Predator Chatham School of Music is a prestigious school in Manchester, and until 1994, the director of music there was Michael Brewer. Brewer, who was also the director of the National Youth Choir and was awarded an Obe for his services to music, was handed a jail sentence in 2013. The charge was sexual abuse, and the story gets even darker. According to the BBC, it started for Frances Andrade when she was 14 years old. Brewer was her teacher, and repeatedly assaulted her between 1978 and 1982. Brewer's then-wife, Hillary, was also involved in the assault and was arrested, charged, and convicted separately. None of this came to light until years later, and when it did, law enforcement stumbled into other complaints that had been covered up, and another affair with a 17-year-old student. Andrade testified in court, and several of the charges against Brewer and his ex-wife were dropped mid-trial. Only 6 days after hearing that news, Andrade committed suicide. The Telegraph reported her son blamed not only Brewer, but his defense counsel, too, for taking the route of calling his mother a liar and a fantasist. Even as the judge declared Brewer to be a predatory sex offender, law enforcement was still tracking down former students and taking more statements about all that had gone on behind the orchestra curtain. Alexander Skriaban Dances with the Devil. Alexander Skriaban was a Russian composer who, according to the Julian calendar, was born on Christmas Day. He eventually came to see that as a bit of extra proof that he was the Messiah. Skriaban was brilliant but troubled, and the Houston Press shares one particular anecdote of just how troubled. His hands were too small for him to play some of the piano pieces he wanted to, so he practiced until they broke, and kept practicing until the bones stretched enough that he could reach the keys. That's the kind of personality we're talking here. After he got interested in religious philosophy and the occult, he became more and more convinced he was destined to change the world. And by change, he meant, bring about the end times. He started writing a massive composition called the Mysterium, which Gramophone says he envisioned as including music, dance, choreographed perfumes and incenses, and more than a few bells. The goal was to stage the entire, 7-day performance in the Himalayan mountains, then kick open the door to the end of days and wipe out humanity. His plans were thwarted in the most anticlimactic way possible. He cut himself shaving, it got infected, and he died. Spade Cooley's Domestic Sorrows. Spade Cooley was born in 1910, so you get a pass if you're not incredibly familiar with his name. He was huge in the 1950s, declared he was the king of Western swing, led a 30-piece band, hosted his own TV show, and made appearances in more than 50 movies. He's even got a star on Hollywood Boulevard, and you may have had a better chance of remembering him if his career hadn't been derailed by alcohol, pills, jealousy, and murder. Weirdly, he was the one who filed for divorce from his second wife, Ella May. According to Taste of Country, they were on the verge of getting back together when he killed her on April 3, 1961. It gets worse, believe it or not. The murder wasn't just incredibly violent. The LA Times says Cooley choked, beat, and stomped her to death, but he did it in front of their 14-year-old daughter, Melody. He also reportedly put a cigarette out on her to make sure she was dead, then sat around in bloody clothes for a few hours before finally calling someone. Melody's testimony ultimately led to his conviction, and he was actually up for parole in 1970. He was granted permission to perform at a charity concert in 1969, but collapsed and died backstage. It's a weird end to the tale of the only celebrity with both a Walk of Fame star and a murder conviction. Lead Belly's penchant for violence. Lead Belly died in 1949, and if you don't remember him, you should at least be glad groups like Creedence Clearwater Revival and artists like Bob Dylan didn't forget him. Even George Harrison once said, "No Lead Belly, no Beatles." You know the songs he recorded, too, like, The Midnight Special, and, Goodnight Irene, via the telegraph. Hudi Ledbetter was born in 1888, and he picked up the name Lead Belly in prison. He did several stretches in jail, starting with 30 days on a chain gang in 1915 for getting in a particularly violent fight. 2 years later he was arrested again, this time for killing his cousin's husband and nearly killing another. He was pardoned in 1925 but went back in jail in 1930, this time for stabbing and what Black history now says was, assault with intent to murder. It was during this stint he was discovered by a pair of musicologists who were recording songs for the Smithsonian, and Lead Belly recorded hundreds for them. The rest of his life was a combination of performing at venues of all sizes across the country, and more time in jail. There was another stabbing incident in 1939, but he stayed out of trouble for the next few years. He was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease only months before he died from it in 1949, and he left behind an incredible legacy. And some dead people. John Lennon. Absent father, woman beater. You likely know John Lennon as the guy who sang, "Imagine all the people living life in peace." Before trying to fix the world's problems, the ex-Beatle should have probably sorted out the not at all peaceful mess that was his home life. Despite his hippie image, Lennon was a guy who left a string of broken people in his wake. He abandoned his first son, Julian, when the poor boy was only 5. As Julian himself has said, Lennon then basically blocked the kid from his mind, giving Julian's mom, Cynthia, just enough money for school and clothes and not a penny more. Acceptable when you're barely scraping a living for yourself, maybe, but kinda unacceptable when you're part of literally the most famous band on earth. Still, in some ways Lennon's abandonment of Julian may have been a blessing in disguise. Vice reports that while he was still with Cynthia, Lennon would verbally abuse the boy over the slightest things and leave piles of drugs lying around the house. He also had a string of affairs, a practice he carried over to his marriage with Yoko Ono, although Ono doesn't seem to have minded. Perhaps worst of all, though, was Lennon's admission in a 1980 Playboy interview that he used to sometimes hit the women in his life. It really doesn't take much effort to imagine Lennon was a prize jerk. R. Kelly the pervert cultist. In terms of musical significance, no one has had such an impact on R&B as R. Kelly. In terms of making your lunch want to exit your body at high velocity, no one has had as much impact on your stomach as the same man. R. Kelly is a guy who has taken male privilege and pushed it to extremes so sickening that even the abstract concept of toxic masculinity finds him disgusting. For 25 years now, we've had well-documented instances of Kelly abusing women, harassing women, grooming teenage girls, and allegedly even doing utterly screwed-up stuff like peeing on a 14-year-old, according to Variety. The accusations are now so unrelenting that Lifetime was able to dedicate 6 whole hours for its harrowing documentary series Surviving R. Kelly. Perhaps one of the worst accusations is that Kelly kept black teenage girls in a demented sex cult, grooming them, abusing them, and having them cut off all contact with friends and family to become his personal slaves. A 2019 BBC documentary found evidence that Kelly kept 14-year-old girls as pets, a term that probably sums up all you need to know about his view of women. Still, we happily now live in a world where being rich and famous is no longer a guaranteed get-out-of-jail-free card. Following the broadcast of Surviving R. Kelly, Chicago and Atlanta prosecutors opened new investigations into the singer, via Guardian. Ian Dury was an alcoholic bully. There's an old anecdote about British musician Ian Dury's drunken antics that kind of sums up everything about him. Disabled in one arm and one leg by a childhood battle with polio, the alcoholic Dury nonetheless liked to get drunk and insult the biggest, meanest, nastiest guy in any given pub, just to see if they would try and fight a disabled person. Sometimes they would, and Dury's bandmates would step in and finish the fight for him. Since it often ended in a beating for the band members, sticking up for drunken Dury became known as Dury duty. Dury's acid tongue wounded more than just random bruisers in various London pubs. According to his son, Baxter, Dury was like a Polaris missile, able to lock onto anyone's weakness in seconds and verbally destroy them. This violence was dished out basically whenever he'd been drinking. He would hurt family, friends, children, or whoever happened to wander into sight. Speaking of Baxter, Dury was also kind of an unusual father to him. By which we mean that he once left teenage Baxter in the care of a violent drug addict known as the sulfate strangler for 3 whole years. The two bonded and became friends, but that doesn't change the fact that this was basically a terrible idea. Ike Turner's shocking record of domestic violence before he became famous as Tina Turner's husband. Ike Turner was famous for being one of the handful of people who could claim to have invented rock and roll, via Mike. After he married Tina, Ike was yet more famous for being a husband so abusive that murdering him might have led to the creation of a whole new category of justifiable homicide. Tina once wrote that their lives together were defined by abuse and fear. According to The Cut, Ike took Tina to a brothel on their wedding night. He routinely did cocaine and then had sex with her in such a brutal way that Tina admitted it felt more like rape. He sometimes beat her. At various times he broke her nose, broke her jaw, gave her 2 black eyes, and left her with third-degree burns after hurling hot coffee in her face. At one moment in her autobiography Tina, the star writes with shocking frankness about tasting blood from a beating as she sang on stage. There are also rumors, many recounted in a Spin magazine interview in which Ike tried to defend his behavior, that he threatened to kill Tina, shot bullets into her house after they split up, and once drove her to attempt suicide. When asked about it, Ike said, "I didn't hit her more than the average guy beats his wife." What a class act. Michael Jackson. Credible accounts of child abuse in the post-Me Too era. We've learned that the rich and powerful will frequently do everything they can to silence accusers. That may be why, despite an all-out assault by the Jackson estate calling its subjects' credibility into account, the documentary Leaving Neverland is actually getting shown on TV. A 4-hour film featuring detailed interviews with 2 men who say they survived persistent abuse at the hands of Michael Jackson as children. It was so shocking when screened at Sundance that IndieWire's reviewer said it proves Michael Jackson sexually abused children. According to Variety, Leaving Neverland slowly builds an effective, methodical case with so many damning details that it becomes hard to question. Not that people haven't tried. The 2 accusers, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, had previously defended Jackson at his trial and later lost a civil suit against the estate for abuse allegations. Jackson's estate says this shows their story is motivated by greed. Still, what a story it is. Robson and Safechuck credibly allege that Jackson groomed them as children, molested them, forced them to perform sex acts on him, and even staged a mock wedding with Safechuck. All the while Jackson threatened them with prison if they ever told a soul. That's a classic abuser power play. It might finally be time to delete Beat It from your Spotify. Carlo Goswaldo's murderous rampage. Carlo Goswaldo was a 16th-century composer who wrote some of the era's most powerful compositions, and they're pretty dark. The Guardian says it's no wonder he wrote such dark stuff because he was a pretty dark guy. Let's start with an account of the murder, via the New Yorker music critic Alex Ross. Ross says the double murder happened on October 16, 1590, and officials first found the body of the Duke of Andria. He was covered in blood, shot several times, and stabbed in the chest, neck, face, arms, hands, shoulders, and kidneys. Then they found Goswaldo's wife. She'd had her throat cut, and was also covered in wounds. There was absolutely no doubt as to who the murderer was, as witnesses saw Goswaldo enter the apartment and shout, "Kill that scoundrel," along with this harlot. Those witnesses testified he came out covered in blood, said he wasn't sure they were quite dead, and went back in. Since Goswaldo was a prince as well as a composer, the justice system didn't quite do its thing. More stories started popping up about other horrific acts Goswaldo committed, and while a lot of them aren't true, it is true that he married again and had so many affairs his new bride eventually put his mistresses on trial for witchcraft. They were found guilty and locked up in Goswaldo's castle, which presumably wasn't what his long-suffering, and, by all accounts, abused, wife was hoping for.